Hey, good looking, what you got cooking? How's about cooking something up with me? Nothing like a little Hank Williams in the morning. I think that's the first time I've ever sung Hank Williams songs. Anyway, hope you guys are doing okay and ready to embark upon another segment of History 101. History 101 students are the finest students in the entire world, so you go, people. Okay, so one thing that's kind of important to note is that, I can't tell you everything in American history, but I always try to tell you the most important thing. That's kind of the way I always want to perceive it. I do think that, I've established the constitutional regime for us. Okay, it kind of took us up to about 1800. And, I know that probably most history classes at that point would then begin to look at the administrations of, let's say, Washington and Adams, the election of 1800, administration of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. And there are stories there. There's always going to be something interesting in all those kind of stories. There's no doubt about that. During the Adams administration, intense kind of actions in association with the French Revolution, Alien and Sedition Act, Citizen Guinea Affair. The election of 1800 was the first really contested election. This is Adams against Jefferson, and the two of them went after each other super hard. We can date our really mudslinging politics all the way back, to that moment, basically, and also kind of increasingly firming up of kind of the notion of political parties. There's something called the era of good, well, I should have done this before. There's the War of 1812, which occurred, I don't know, I think probably around 1812 or something like that. The thing I always think about when I think of the War of 1812 is that the last battle, the famous Battle of New Orleans, is fought after the peace has been called. It's kind of sad that they couldn't quite get the information to the people there on the battlefield. During the Monroe administration, there's something called the era of good feelings. I'm not even sure I've heard about that, but I'm not sure what it even is necessarily. So, I don't do that. And there's a reason that I don't kind of focus on like the government developments of that particular moment. And the reason is the government was really small in those days and relatively inconsequential. And it's not an important thing. As late as 1830, Congress would routinely meet only 3 months out of the year, so that just means there's not enough business for them they stay there all year, so 3 months is what they're going to do. The president would usually be in office for, in Washington for about 9 months out of the year, and then in the summer it just got super hot, and so they'd want to take off someplace to kind of cool off if they could. The president got by with one secretary. Can you imagine the president just needing one secretary? There were about, I think, over 300,000 people who worked for the government. But the vast majority of those were the soldiers and sailors, of course, of the United States that are kind of scattered out across the frontier and also, of course, on the ocean. And the number one activity of the government really was to deliver the mail. And so, to me, that's interesting, right? But it's not the essence of kind of what's happening in that particular moment. I do want you to know that a critical development, which I will highlight to a degree, is the increasingly democratic nature of America, small d democracy, where more and more Americans feel more and more involved in the political process. And that's important to know, right? But just looking at the governments of that time, it seems like that's not the way to proceed. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you that story, of course. What I do is I try to find what I think is the most important thing that we should be looking at and develop that. All right, so here we go. What I'm going to present to you now, and this is really our penultimate major topic, and it spans, quite a bit of material. I'm going to call it Antebellum America. Antebellum America. You will note that these are printed today. I was trying to give my wife a little bit of time off because I've been abusing her, and she's threatening to go on strike and stuff like that, but we're trying to get negotiations and work that all out. Anyway, Antebellum America, so these are the years between 1800 and 1860. Now, for the historian, Antebellum America is something that you talk about all the time. And indeed, I was a historian of Antebellum America. That's my specific area of specialization. So, when I hear that, it resonates with me, okay? But it wouldn't necessarily with everybody because, these words aren't meaningful. So America, I hope you guys all know that, of course. It could be Vespucci land, and that would have been cool, but of course we're going to call it America. But antebellum, that's kind of foreign to most people. All right, so let me parse this for you. So we're looking at two words here. And the first word, of course, ante, and the second, these are actually two Latin words, ante and bellum. Now, ante, I'm going to give you guys just a chance to guess for half a second here. Anti is A-N-T-E, not A-N-T-I. If it's anti, of course, it's against. But anti, and we see anti in like antipasta or anterior. So antipasta, what does that mean? You guys ever done that before? It means before the pasta. So an anterior means what you're going to come in first, okay? So ante means before. That's the Latin word for before. Bellum is a word that is associated with the English words bellicose and belligerent. This is also a Latin word. I'm going to give you one chance to guess. Bellum means, you shout it out. If you said war, you're absolutely correct, right? So bellum is war. So antebellum is before the war, before the war. So my topic for you right now is Antebellum America. This is America before the war. So, you know, it's a powerful kind of suggestion of exactly what is important in this particular historical period. By the way, in American history, when you say the war in the 19th century, everyone knows what war you're talking about. It is really the greatest moment in American, and most dramatic, important moment really in American history in many ways, and that of course is the Civil War. So this is America before the Civil War. Now it's both somewhat problematic and I think really appropriate that we call it Antebellum America. And one of the issues that I have, you know, like this could be a problem, is the fact that those who lived in America at that time, let's say in the 1830s, would have no idea that they lived in Antebellum America. I mean, if you walk down the street of some city in America in 1830, in New York or whatever, and you said, so tell me, what's it like living here in Antebellum America? They'd give you a very strange look. And of course, then you'd have to go through this long explanation. America could have been Vespucci land, but we know that, you know, didn't happen. So ante, Latin for before, like antipod, you know, do the whole thing that I just did for you. And even when you were done with all that explanation, they would still look at you like, what the hell are you talking about? And that means that, you know, no one who lived in Antebellum America knew they lived in Antebellum America. Though I do want you to know, and I've just realized I don't have much of my lighting here, as much as I should have. You know, I do want you to know that, you know, they did know that they were heading towards the Civil War. Towards the latter part of the antebellum period, there was increasingly a sense that they might be heading in that particular direction, but you know, they didn't know that, okay? Because you know, how could they anticipate it? So, you know, one of the things it sounds like it's problematic because, you know, it's like we're blaming these people for the Civil War. And, you know, you are the people of Antebellum America. Your attitudes, your behaviors, your actions will lead us to the Civil War. And, you know, they wouldn't have known that that was going to happen. And, you know, in early part of the Antebellum, no one would have had any kind of clue that that was even going to be something like a problem. But, you know, here's the thing. We are kind of responsible for the future. You know, we could live... I was going to say we could live in anti-catastrophic America. We're actually living kind of in catastrophic America right now. I mean, it's really a troubling kind of moment for us. But you know, there could be other catastrophic moments down the road. They could be environmental. They could be nuclear war. You know, all these kind of things. And I have to tell you that, you know, if it gets to an absolute catastrophic point in terms of the environment, or it does become nuclear war, then, you know, we are responsible. We're responsible for the future. If we don't do what is necessary to make sure things don't go really badly, then it is our fault. It's basically our fault. So I don't really mind blaming the people. The people who lived in America at that time, their actions, their thoughts, their attitudes, their behaviors, they led to the Civil War, okay? And that's the outcome of that situation. So even though they didn't realize they lived in Antebellum America, we do. We know they did. And you know, it's not inappropriate for us to remark upon that in a major way. Now, this should give you the essential clue of what, you know, I'm going to be talking about. The major event of the 19th century is the Civil War. And so, you know, the history kind of increasingly sort of funnels towards that. So we'll be interested, of course, in what leads to the Civil War. It's the most important thing that's going to happen at this time. And, you know, much of my presentation from this point on will be kind of focusing on those issues that will lead us to the Civil War. But in the antebellum, in the period of Antebellum America, there are sort of three major developments that I want to, and I think these are the most important things happening in America at that time. So these are the three things I'm going to focus on. Now, the first thing I'm going to focus on is the extraordinary and dynamic growth of America in the antebellum period. You know, the thing I think that is probably the most important thing that happened in the antebellum period is that the United States began to really grow and develop in a major way. If you tell the story perfectly, it's a 100-year story. You know, it doesn't quite work. It works all right within a 60-year period, so 1800 to 1860. But if you told the story perfectly, you know, you go from like 1800 to 1900 because you see the extraordinary developments in the United States. In 1800, the United States was not really that much of an important country. I've always thought it's, here's one of my weird things, is my own naivete, especially when I was a child. But I would think about George Washington as a child, and I would think about George Washington as being the President of the United States, and I would think that that meant that George Washington was one of the most important people in the world, because the President of the United States today is one of the most important people in the world. But the reality was that George Washington was the president of a podunk little country that no one really paid attention to in any kind of way. Now, he wasn't the most very important. The vast majority of the major political leaders of the world would have little to think about or even know about George Washington. So this is just my own little naive kind of understanding. So this is a small country. America's a small country. It had great potential. Understand, it had great potential. It shows all the dynamics of growth that I'm going to highlight for you guys. But America is not really a consequential country in the year 1800. Now, I always try to think, like, what would be the equivalent today? And I don't even know. I always turn to Chile. Chile is an interesting country, important country in its own way. It's kind of like California South in terms of agriculture. But no one looks at Chile and says that's a world leader or something like that. America would have been like the Chile of 1800, all right? But by 1900, the United States is the most powerful country in the entire world. It's the richest country in the world. It's the most powerful country, and relatively soon after that, it will express its military capacity to show the world, that it is amazingly powerful. It will become the dominant nation of the 20th century. So clearly something's happening, a growth is taking place here. When you go from the podunk country of 1800 to the extraordinary country of 1900. Now, admittedly, much of this is occurring, or parts of this development are occurring after the Civil War. I focused that in 102, of course, dynamic growth in terms of industrialization, urbanization, immigration, what turns America ultimately modern. But much of the foundational growth of America is between 1800 and 1860. And so what I'm going to want to do is look at this dynamic growth. It's a tremendously thing. And I forgot to do my outline. I hope you guys remember always to print out your outline. You can stop the video right now, go print out your outline from Canvas so that you can always be kind of following along in an effective kind of way. And once we get the study sheet, of course, you want to have that at hand too, so you can begin to see what exactly are the identifications. And I'm beginning the presentation of essay question number 1, to be honest with you. So there are 3 manifestations of dynamic growth I'm going to highlight for you. I want to tell you about the population growth, of course. It's continually important. And there is a little bit of redundancy, that becoming Americans, that's kind of a growth dynamic too. But, different situations now. So we look at population growth, number 1, issues of natural increase in immigration. We look at, and here's one that's different, the extraordinary territorial expansion of the United States in the antebellum period. This is that moment when the United States of America began to achieve its extraordinarily familiar shape. It's almost like I could draw that with my eyes closed or something like that. The contiguous area of the United States, all of it was acquired. Even by 1853, you don't have to wait all the way till 1860 before you have this kind of this acquisition. I'm going to take 1 second to get a little more light on this side. Coming right back. Ta-da! Usually pretty good at my setup, just sort of forgot a few things this time. Anyway, so the extraordinary territorial expansion, of course, which really is one of the more dramatic stories at this moment, and a story that I really like to tell. And then the third story is the story of the economic growth of America. And what we have occurring in this moment is the foundation of the modern American economy. And the modern American economy is the greatest economy the world has ever seen. And although, it doesn't reach that kind of extraordinary expression until later in the century, we don't believe until about 1890 did the United States economy surpass all the other economies. And by 1914, it's like outproducing the rest of the world. It's kind of an amazing moment there of economic growth and development. But the beginning of that is clearly an antebellum phenomenon. So, these are the 3 things I'm going to look at here. Population growth, territorial expansion, and economic growth in the antebellum period, which allows the United States to create, I should say, the foundations of becoming the great nation it's going to become. It's happening. So, that essay question will say between 1800 and 1860, the United States began to rise to its great nation status. And indeed, that is absolutely true. In 1865, just to give you one more little point here, the United States had the largest military in the world, And even though that was momentary, and it was all associated, of course, with the Civil War, even for a moment to have the largest military in the world, that shows you that something is happening here, and that's quite remarkable. So the first thing we're going to talk about in terms of the antebellum period is this extraordinary and dynamic growth that's taking place. The second thing is that as the growth occurs, the nation becomes increasingly divided. So I call this the house divided. And the suggestion too will be that during the antebellum period, the North and the South began to diverge in a very significant way. And when I get to this point, I'm going to use the road analogy because I think it just really works, that the nation is heading down one road. And to be honest with you, the Southerners kind of stay on that road. But the Northerners diverge. The Northerners take off in a little bit of a different direction. And, the signposts on the road the Northerners are taking are the things that are happening in the North that really change it. It's all about urbanization. It's all about immigration. It's all about industrialization. And pretty soon, the North and the South are pretty darn different. The essay question says, that by 1850, the North and the South had become like two different countries. And there's fact to support that kind of situation. And I'll want to characterize the North, show you what the North is all about, of course, where they're going. And I want to characterize the South, of course, to show you where they're going. This is going to become its own essay question. So we see the North and the South diverging. And of course, I'm sure you can understand that that's creating a foundation for potential problems. And of course, the ultimate problem will be the Civil War. Then the final thing that becomes sort of this extraordinary expression of the antebellum period is something called the sectional crisis. So the sectional crisis is when these divisions between the North and the South become politicized. And when they become politicized, they become more emotional, of course, and there's less of ability to control the situation. By definition, a crisis is a situation out of control. If you're in control, it's not a crisis, okay? But there begins to be a crisis that develops. And I'm sure you guys can guess that it focuses upon the major issue between the North and the South, and that was slavery. And over time it became increasingly politicized, increasingly volatile, and increasingly the Northerners and the Southerners are unable to control the dynamics of what's happening here. And it will ultimately lead, of course, to the Civil War. So the three big things are happening: dynamic growth, it's critically important, creating this big nation, increased division between the North and the South, and then finally that division manifesting in this sectional crisis in which the Americans will increasingly lose control over the situation. Okay. So those are the big three, and I will take me some time to get through them all. Okay, and the first one I really want to focus on, I have a lot of information on this one for you guys, is the dynamic growth of America, because I really do think it is the most important thing. The Americans are developing, towards becoming a great nation, and so this has to be kind of paramount in terms of what's going on. I've already given you kind of a clue of the parameters here. I want to give you a sense of the population growth, of course, the territorial expansion, which is just remarkable, and of course, ultimately, the economic growth. Each one of them really, allowing the nation to expand itself in dramatic fashion, every way you can think of: population expansion, territorial expansion, economic expansion, to the point, of course, as I've already told you, that by the time we get to 1900, the United States is indeed the most powerful country in the entire world. So we're going to take each point in time and kind of develop them for you. So the first thing I want to give you some sense of in terms of the dynamic growth of America in the antebellum period is population growth. You guys remember from before whatever that was, back when I was doing Becoming Americans, second midterm, my focal point in many ways was the dynamic population growth of the colonies, right? And it's just one of those things that just is kind of a critical factor in terms of American history. We just see consistent population growth as a foundation, of course, of the great nation status. Now, what you do in population growth, of course, you look at the demography, and I'm going to give you the demographic facts associated with the population growth in the antebellum period, and here they are for you. So, when last we left the population, if you guys can remember way back to Becoming Americans, in 1775, on the eve of the Revolution, the population of the colonies was 2.5 million. And I told you that was an extraordinary population for that time. By 1800, it was 5 million. You can see that there. By 1850, it had grown to 23 million. And by 1860, 31 million. So the population had increased 6 times between 1800 and 1860. So significant population growth. And of course, what we do here, we could do the absolute analysis, comparing it to population in the United States today. 1860, 31 million, that's less than the state of California today. So the population still is relatively small relative to our current population situation. But on their own terms, it just shows dramatic growth. And indeed, the United States had the fastest growing population in the world. So it continues to have the fastest growing population in the world. I told one, I came across something that if the population growth rates of the colonial and antebellum period had continued, we'd have like 1.3 billion people in America. We'd be like the size of China. So, it's both important to see the incredible growth, but also to know that this is going to have to change. You cannot keep that kind of population growth when the population gets as large as ours. Now, because it's an issue of the moment, I want to do this sectional story on you guys. So, yes, it's the nation, the population is growing, but because we're heading to the Civil War, it's always kind of important to understand what's going on between the North and the South. So I'm going to parse unpack it a little bit, population in terms of the North and the South. So if you look at this, you see that the North had 21 million people in 1860, and the South had 9 million people in 1860. So just right there, you see a fairly significant demographic edge on the part of the North. Not three times, but more than twice the population of the South is in the North, right? And of course, remember that if there's a war, it's not going to be 21 million versus 9 million. It'd be the adult male population of 21 million versus that of 9 million. Understand that that's not exactly the story though for the South, because 3.9 million Southerners were slaves, and so essentially not eligible by the standards of the Southerners themselves. Only at the very end of the Civil War was there even a little consideration of trying to use the blacks as soldiers, and of course, I can't imagine that many of them would really want to participate in anything like that. So really, it's more like the adult male population of 21 million versus the adult male population of 5 million people. So you see that the North has a huge demographic edge, and of course, that becomes a foundation for the ultimate victory of the North in the Civil War. So, population is important, of course, but I also want you to be seeing the sectional component as far as population is concerned. Okay, so we have this extraordinarily fast-growing population, and in some ways this is kind of redundant relative to what I've done before in colonial America. I want us to understand why this population grew so rapidly. And if you guys remember, there are two ways that a population can grow. I'm going to let you guess before I tell you. The two ways are... Yes, that's right. So natural increase on the one hand. Remember that that's a preponderance of births over deaths. And the other major factor is immigration. And the two of them are going to come into play in a major way as far as the antebellum period is concerned. So let's first just mention natural increase. So I write here SOS, and you can say that means whatever you want to say, but I think same old story. So I'm really not going to change the story very much right here. So what's happening in the antebellum period is pretty much the same thing that was happening in terms of the colonial period. So it's based on an extraordinarily good resource base, and remember that that resource base is expanding to the entire area of the United States, even more land. I mean, all of a sudden you get like Iowa, and of course Iowa is a hugely productive agricultural state, and all the other things that are available there. So the natural resources of the United States are available to this burgeoning population, and that's going to be a foundational reason for a rapid population growth. The other things are it's still the human behavior issues, of course. We're still looking at women, and we see them getting married at a relatively early age, of course. The age is creeping up a little bit. Remember, it was 15. The average age was 15 in colonial America. We see it slowly creeping up. But if you remember the example that I used, Anna Myatt, she actually was 16. I'm presuming she was 16 at the time she was born. The time she was born, the time she was married, So, we see it maybe creeping up a little, but they're still getting married at a relatively early age, and they're still becoming procreatively active, of course, at the height of their fertility, which creates the potential for having a whole bunch of babies. We still see the unencumbered fecundity. Remember that my example again was Anna Myatt. That's 1850. She's got her 9 kids. I remember one time when I was looking through the Mississippi census of 1850, and I saw a 27-year-old woman with 10 kids, and their ages were like 9, 8, 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then I think the last one was like 3 over 12, so 3 months old, and she was probably pregnant at that moment with another child. So you still see the dynamics of unencumbered fecundity largely taking place. And then finally, life expectancy is going up for, not life expectancy, infant mortality. Sorry, I just messed that up. Infant mortality. Remember that in colonial America, we're looking at 30% infant mortality rates, just horrific by our contemporary standards, but that's going to start to go down. I screwed that up totally. So the infant mortality rates are starting to go down. Life expectancy is probably raising to some degree, but it's the infant mortality rate that we're much more interested in. So we're heading down to 20% infant mortality. to 10%, so that means that, only 1 out of 10 babies instead of 3 out of 10 babies is going to die. So, all those things are factors increasing the rate of natural increase in a very fundamental way. So a lot of the story in terms of Antebellum America is the same thing I already told you with colonial America. The same old situation continues on, okay? However, there is one distinct difference that I do want to highlight. There was one particular element of the population who begin to change their behavior. And in doing this, it doesn't have a huge demographic impact yet, but it will ultimately have an impact, and it will begin to transform the nature of natural increase in terms of the higher nation. So here we go. The northern urban middle class began to change their behaviors, and they began to, what we say, the way I'm going to call this, encumber their fecundity. If you guys remember, one of the phenomenon, of course, of colonial America was unencumbered fecundity. So that meant nothing cultural or technological to inhibit women from getting pregnant at every single opportunity, and the average colonial woman is going to have 10 pregnancies. Well, that's not going to be the case for the northern urban middle class. Remember, it's not everybody. We're not talking about Southerners. We're not talking about the rural people who are the mass of the Americans. We're not even talking about rich people, really. It's the northern urban middle class who began to encumber their fecundity. Now, the question is kind of why. And I think the answer is sort of in the description here. So one critical factor is that they are urban. So they're living in the city. Now, if you live on a farm, you want a lot of kids because the kids are your labor. They're also kind of your social security. But if you live in a city, the kids become not a liability, but an encumbrance maybe to some degree, right? If you have too many of them. You got to have a bigger house if you have lots of kids, of course. And the kids aren't going to do the same things. You hope the oldest boy is going to mow the lawn, but there's not that much for them to do. So you lose that demand for labor, basically. And I don't think it was just totally that. It was also a sense of the improvement of the life of the children. The fewer children you have, the more attention you could give to them, the more money you could devote to them. All that. So it's not just some kind of issue of labor demand. It's a desire on the part of the parents to improve the life of themselves too. Themselves and their families, basically. So they began to reduce the number of children that they were going to have. I remember that when I was a kid, I thought for sure that when I got married, I would have 4 kids. And then, of course, I do get married, and then we do start having children. But by the time we had 2 of them, and my wife was working, and I'm working too, you realize the burden of you have to kind of make some serious adjustments to your understanding of this. And so after 2, we thought we could manage that. We could, having the child care issues, take care of them, getting them through college, all the issues. That was, I would have wanted more kids if I thought it was possible. We began to think it was impossible. Not to mention the fact that, if we only had 2 kids and it was like 2 on 2 when the fights come, even though they did beat us up upon occasion. But anyway, the northern urban middle class simply make a decision, that this isn't the right situation for them. So they're going to encumber their fecundity. Now, what that means in real terms, of course, is they're going to have fewer children. And I want you to know it's not a massive drop-off. They're not going to like where we are now, 1.8 kids. But the northern urban middle class tended to have 4 to 6 children. So they're cutting down on the number in a relatively significant kind of way. And, there's a whole bunch of issues here, or questions. One of the more interesting ones, of course, is how did they do it? How do you encumber your fecundity? And I'm sure that you guys can think of some ways that you could probably do that. But, part of it was a cultural component of that period. So this is the Victorian era, and the Victorian era is a time of gross prescriptions. That's my adjective, prescriptions that are placed upon women in terms of their behavior, the way they had to wear their clothing, the way they had to look, the way they had to wear their hair. It's just a time when women are really restrained in terms of many, many things. And part of the Victorian ethos was that women were asexual. So, this is not going to be accepted by every single woman, but for like the middle class, the upper middle class, these notions were kind of the norms. And so the woman was supposed to be asexual. And that means she was not supposed to like sex, and only really to tolerate sex essentially for procreation. And I guess, that played into the moment, right? So these are prim northern middle class women who are supposed to be asexual, and thus, you're not going to be seeking sexual intercourse that much, and that may, lead to moments or periods of abstinence or something like that, which of course would begin to encumber the fecundity. I do want you to know that this is not a good time for women. Sigmund Freud makes a living off of this. He will make a career basically studying these women, of course, who are suffering from their repressed sexuality. He will claim that they, of course, suffer from hysteria, which you and I would call anxiety. He will say that they will suffer from melancholia, which you and I will call depression. And in many ways, as he begins to popularize his notions, it will liberate women from, of course, the restraints that had held them down in this particular area. But just the Victorian culture kind of, had an impact here. But if that wasn't it, they could use the rhythm method. That means that you're trying to avoid, of course, having sex during ovulation, coitus interruptus, early withdrawal. That could be something. There were condoms available. I don't know exactly what form they were. The condoms are ancient. Well, not ancient, but they go back to like the 16th century in France. Animal skin condoms. The galvanized rubber ones are coming somewhat later, I think. That could be a device they could use, and other things that they could use. So there were ways that you could begin to encumber your fecundity. But the salient point here is not so much that there's some technology that you can fall back upon to avoid pregnancy. It's really just that these people decided they didn't want to have as many children. I don't want to offend anybody, but children are always a choice. They say it's a baby, not a choice. They're always kind of a choice. You make your decisions. Do you want to have a child? Patty and I decided we could have 2 kids, and that way it was going to happen. And that was their decision. We're not going to have any more children from that particular point on, and that's what we did. Okay, that's the choice that we made. And so they simply decided they didn't want to have children, and they didn't. I didn't say that they don't want to have as many children, right? And they didn't have as many children. So that's kind of the outcome there. Anyway, this always makes me think of how we deal with the issue of abortion. And so, of course, you have right to life on one side, and you've got pro-choice on the other side. And I've always thought, can't we just get along? And so I would combine, 2 words there, and right choice. Make the right choice. And this isn't just for women, of course; it's for men too. Make the right choice. Avoid unwanted pregnancies. Unwanted pregnancies are the bane of the situation. If there are no unwanted pregnancies, there are no abortions. But that's maybe too reasonable for the world to kind of contemplate in any kind of way. But anyway, amen. I'm done preaching on that particular issue. Last thing I want to say about these northern urban middle class people, though, especially the women. I think I tried to suggest to you that the women who were in colonial America who participated in unencumbered fecundity, it kind of ruled their lives. I pictured them always on the unencumbered fecundity railroad. They get married at 15, they have baby, and then they die. And their lives are sort of lost to them. They couldn't control these lives. So they called it confinement, and it was kind of real. And they didn't have control over their bodies. Their bodies were out of control. Their bodies were baby-making machines. So it inhibited them in so many ways. They couldn't do that much. Well, these northern urban middle-class women began to encumber their fecundity, and it's sort of amazing. The liberation from the endless numbers of babies that you're supposed to produce allowed these women to do some interesting kind of things. Getting a blinking. Damn. It's a storage issue. I'm going to continue on, just see if we can overcome this. So, these women were liberated, and we see in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s sort of a woman's movement beginning to appear among these women. And we see them beginning to be concerned with slavery and abolitionism. We see them begin to kind of transfer those issues, of course, of liberty for slaves to themselves and equality to themselves. We see the rise of a women's movement, of course, promoting the right of women to vote. There's the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 where these women came together. And the thing I love is that they make like a manifesto, and it uses the Declaration of Independence. The history of the current society or history of men is, the attempt to establish an absolute tyranny over women. And by the way, of course, they would say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. I'm getting 2 little blinkers. I better stop. Okay, I'll get back to you as soon as I can.